So our next presenters, Dr. Valerie Adams-Bass, Dr. Erin Bogan, and Dr. Noni Gaylord, they have been doing extensive research during this time, specifically around Black and Brown children and the COVID-19 trauma. What we have experienced and what has been shown is that our Black children are experiencing COVID and this time differently than many of our other students. I can say for me personally, I watched my 12-year-old nephew go through 3 months on a ventilator and is still struggling with it now. And I just recently lost my aunt after she went through COVID twice. So we are seeing a lot more due to the fact that our children are living in multi-generational homes, that they're under-resourced, and that they might not have the same access to healthcare. And then, of course, the understood distrust of the medical community due to the history that African Americans have had with things like Tuskegee and things like that. So we know that there is distrust, and it's very well-deserved distrust. And so it's affecting our Black youth differently. And these young doctors have taken the time to do the research to tell us a little bit more about what this trauma is looking like and what we can do to prepare for this trauma. So without further ado, I will pass this over to the doctors.
Good morning, and thank you, Panisha, for having us. Thank you for that introduction. We would also like to give a heartfelt thanks to all of the educators and all of your work every day, but especially right now, the challenges you've overcome during this global pandemic. And we are going to spend some time today discussing the pandemic's impact on Black youth and families. Okay, so a little bit about who we are. As Panisha mentioned, we are all researchers. We're all affiliated with different institutions. I am a professor at Texas A&M University. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I will allow Valerie and Erin to give a bit about their background. My work focuses on stress and trauma in Black youth and families. What ties us together is that we are all members of the Society for Research on Child Development. And a part of that organization, we are also members of the Black Caucus. And the Black Caucus for SRCD is dedicated to promoting the development and well-being of Black children and families through research and intervention. Now, as a part of our membership in SRCD, the Black Caucus was charged with writing what SRCD calls a state of the evidence brief. And these briefs were supposed to be focused on inequities in education during the COVID-19 pandemic. And each caucus was charged with focusing on the impact of COVID on their respective populations. And of course, for the Black Caucus, that meant we were working on a brief that focused on the impact of the pandemic on Black children. And we were charged with writing this brief to summarize the impact, but to also provide recommendations for educational policy. And this policy was supposed to be geared towards minimizing the negative impact of the pandemic on educational outcomes. And our brief was published and disseminated in September of 2020. We will be pulling from some of that today to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on Black youth and families, as well as providing some recommendations for educators. Just a very quick summary of what this is going to look like today. I'm going to give a quick summary of the pandemic's impact on Black youth and families. I'm going to talk a bit about what trauma looks like, particularly for Black youth. Dr. Adams-Bass is going to come on and talk about implications for educational outcomes in Black youth. And then Dr. Bogan is going to come on and talk about protective factors, in particular, emotion regulation as a protective factor and how we might be ready to use that at an organizational level and through programming. And then Dr. Adams-Bass is going to come back for a closing statement. So we are coming up on a year, can you believe this? 1 year since we first started hearing about COVID-19. And in the early stages of the pandemic, if you remember, there were some politicians and even some doctors calling COVID-19 the great equalizer. And this was due to its capability to infect anyone. No one is safe, is what we were told. And there was some validity to this statement. No one is immune to COVID-19. But calling the virus an equalizer is false. Although families of all racial and ethnic groups are affected by COVID-19, it became very clear that Black families were bearing a disproportionate burden of this negative impact. There was an overrepresentation of Black Americans in terms of both COVID-19 rates and mortality. According to the CDC, Black Americans made up 13% of the population in the US, but they were representing 33% of hospitalizations due to COVID and 34% of deaths due to COVID. The death rates in many cities were 50% higher than what would be expected for Black Americans. I heard a figure recently that 1 in 2 Black Americans know someone who has died from COVID. And so calling this the great equalizer is problematic. Why are rates higher? Well, as Panisha mentioned a few minutes ago, as a result of systemic racism, Black Americans have been put in conditions that increase their exposure to COVID-19. We've been hearing for months and months, you have to social distance, you have to social distance, you have to social distance to stay safe. And Black Americans are more likely to be placed in conditions that make social distancing challenging. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you have some of those examples there. All of these things are linked in that they are connected to underlying health conditions that increase the risk for COVID-19. So rather than a great equalizer, this pandemic has proven to be a great amplifier. It has amplified pre-existing social inequalities, pre-existing health inequities in ways that are having a devastating impact on the Black community. And many public health researchers believe that this impact will be decades long. So what does this mean for our young people? Well, as we talked about in our brief, Black children are experiencing more economic loss due to occupational segregation. We have a disproportionate number of Black Americans that are in low-wage jobs or have incomes below the poverty line, and they're more financially vulnerable to the effects of COVID-19. We have a much higher proportion of Black workers that have lost their jobs or had their hours reduced. And so Black families are overrepresented among families that are experiencing food insecurity, difficulty paying bills, and also housing instability. Black children are also losing loved ones. They're experiencing more grief and loss. The loss of loved ones due to COVID-19 is unique because it's often rapid and unexpected, but at the same time, it's compounded by this inability to engage in our typical funeral rituals or having to be disconnected from those who we are losing in the final stages of their life. Black children are also experiencing elevated stress. There have been a number of surveys asking young people about levels of stress, and they found that Black youth tend to experience higher levels of stress as a result of the pandemic. 74% are worried about the effect that the pandemic is having on their family's finances. 71% are worried that they will have a family member that will be exposed to the virus, which is higher than other ethnic groups. Of course, we know that this increased stress is exacerbated by social distancing. This disrupts the relationships they've built with other people, reduces contact with folks who can provide support. All of these things have placed Black children at the epicenter of loss and trauma during the pandemic. But what we also have to remember for Black youth is that the loss and trauma related to COVID-19 is compounded by race-related traumas involving police brutality, the murder of Black men and women at the hands of the police, which was magnified in 2020. COVID-19 also serves as a reminder of historical trauma. Panisha mentioned some of this with our relationships with the healthcare system. It's a reminder of historical trauma and the common traumatic history of racism in the country. It is also the loss of loved ones increases intergenerational trauma, so that we're seeing multi-generational exposure to traumatic experiences. Now, I've been using the word trauma quite a bit, so what do I mean by that? Well, trauma involves things that are overwhelming, experiences that are overwhelming. They exceed our ability to cope. They tax our coping resources. There's some feelings of loss of control or vulnerability. It can be direct or indirect. So it can be something that directly affects you. It can be something that impacts your family or somebody around you. You've heard about it or you've seen it. Now, what I want to mention is that we are biologically primed for survival. So we're biologically primed to respond to threats, even traumatic threats. And in the face of danger, our physiological organism will seek survival. It will go into fight or flight or freeze to help us respond to trauma. But over time, with repeated exposure to trauma that can be exacerbated by these traumatic experiences during COVID-19, we know from research on the brain that there are changes to the brain as a result of trauma exposure. Our prefrontal cortex, which is known as our thinking center, will become underactivated. And that's because when we are exposed to a threat, that shuts down so that we're not slowed down by thinking too much. Our emotion regulation center is underactivated. At the same time, our fear center becomes overactivated. So over time, you have kids whose thinking centers, emotion regulation center, that's the anterior cingulate cortex, and the brain becomes underactivated. Our fear center, the amygdala, becomes overactivated. In addition, our memory systems, for example, the hippocampus, trauma prevents the structure of the brain from transferring memories to the long-term storage. So what happens is that things are just in our short-term memory. They're not stored properly to help us call on them when we need to be reminded of safety, right? Of support. What happens over time is that young people may become threat sensitized. So their bodies are ready to respond to potential threat. Now, what does this look like when we're on the ground working with young people? We see young people that have trouble sleeping. They may have difficulty concentrating, focusing, remembering things. They may appear to be more disorganized. What disorder does that sound like to you, right? We'll come back to that in a second. They may have problems controlling their emotions. They may show hypervigilance. That's constantly scanning their surroundings, being on alert, which means if there's any potential threat, right? At some point, they might just respond rather than the thinking center being activated. There's an increased startle response you may see in kids. They may jump with their certain triggers of these traumas. So think about how these behaviors might show up in the classroom and how we have tended to respond to them when they do. They also can impact relationships, and I think this is really important when we're talking about the classroom. We often see emotional numbing, psychological avoidance, or not going too close. Right? It may affect the sense of safety for these young people. It may diminish trust in other people. We also know that young people can start misinterpreting facial cues. Young people that have been experienced trauma, they may interpret things even benign like non-happiness as anger or threat in an authority figure. And because of the hypervigilance, they may respond more reactively rather than the thoughtful response of considering the alternatives that might be happening in that situation. So our responses to young people matter in the context of trauma. We have punishment and consequence models. We love those models, right? Because we need to have some sort of order in our systems. These don't always work with young people who've experienced trauma because, number one, if the young people don't trust adults, then punishing them reinforces that mistrust. Or if they are hypervigilant, right, and threat sensitized, they may react in ways that are not helpful for them. We have mental health models, right, that focus on diagnosis. The issue is, what is the diagnosis going to be? Many of these symptoms that I showed you can look like other things, such as ADHD or even depression in some cases. And if you have a kid with ADHD, if you have a kid that's being treated for ADHD, they may be treated with a stimulant, but this is going to heighten the physiological arousal. And if it's PTSD instead of ADHD and you have a misdiagnosis, the stimulants aren't going to help. A trauma-informed model is the one that we have been advocating for young people who've been exposed to trauma. And it helps to recognize what their trauma triggers might be, within the classroom or within your system, and it helps to provide safety, structure, and as Dr. Bergen is going to talk about, emotion regulation skills. Now, I do want to say that exposure to a traumatic event does not always equal traumatization. We know that protective factors are very important, particularly relationships with caring adults. We know that when young people can be helped to make meaning out of the experiences, that we can see some post-traumatic growth. And so our questions to ourselves is, how can we create spaces where children feel safe in a world which does not feel safe to them all the time? And how can we create opportunities for children to learn and grow within the context of traumatic experiences? So I'm going to stop and turn this over to Dr. Adams-Bass. Let me see if I can start sharing.
So it may feel like what we are sharing in this slide may be a little bit redundant, but I think it's relevant and important just to be very explicit about how racism is really impacting what Black children, youth, and families are experiencing. And again, both Pernisha and Noni shared this information. And what I want to hone in on really is this assumption that group differences are biologically determined, and Noni really just shared that that's really not the case. But also, more importantly, because we're talking about how the UW system can prepare to welcome children and youth back into the system after COVID-19, really learning a little bit more about it's a systemic oppression. So this idea that systems that we work within, systems that we may be unaware of, really do impact how well young people are received or how well they're able to access resources and receive the support and kinds of education and opportunities that they are entitled, right, and have the rights to. So I just want to have this as a background slide just to really understand there's no scientific biological base for race or racism. It really is a system that's made up and hierarchical that really informs how we work with young people who have differences, and in particular, Black children and families. I'm probably throughout my presentation, which will be brief, going to speak about Black children, youth, and families, because you have to be able to work with both the children and their families in order to do well by them. So I want to sort of make that clear. Oftentimes there's an assumption that if you're working with Black children and you're working with Black youth, that they or their families don't care about education. But we know really through historically Black colleges and institutions and through the research of others that Black children and families, both their parents, really are invested in children doing well in academic environments. And so I just want to reinforce that and set that context. So I share that slide. I want to talk specifically to 2 points from our SRC brief that Noni shared. And one of those is really that Black children face disadvantages in remote learning settings. Why is that important? Well, the digital divide does exist. And for those of you who work in more rural environments, we know that a consistent conversation, having the extension background, I have to self-disclose that I've worked for Penn State Cooperative Extension and Cornell University Cooperative Extension. So very familiar with the 4-H youth development system and how when we're serving young people who live in rural environments, there's dial-up, right? So as we move into this virtual space pre-COVID, there was a consistent conversation around families that we serve in rural environments who do not have access to high-speed internet. Well, it's not just those families in rural environments. We can talk about families who live in suburban and urban environments who also don't have access to high-speed internet, because in this case, it could likely be the communities in which they live, the buildings in which they live, or very much a financial burden of paying for high-speed internet access at home. So what does this mean during COVID-19? Well, what it means during COVID-19 is that young people who were, particularly when we were sheltering in place, in March when it started almost a year, as Noni said, there was no opportunity to go to the local library where there's a digital hub. There was no opportunity to attend school where there's a digital hub. There was no opportunity to actually hang out at a fast food restaurant where there's a free digital hub, or a local mall where there's a free digital hub. So as we transition to this virtual space of learning and connecting with families and children, there are families and were families who did not have access to high-speed internet at home. So then the question becomes, well, how do we deliver education into these homes where they don't have that kind of access? And so that's still very much a conversation. And while that digital divide did exist pre-COVID-19, we became acutely aware of how important and vital having equal access, meaning the same speed of internet, is relevant to all families and all homes, whether they live in rural, urban, or suburban environments, and that it was much more of an acute difference in that access for Black children and families at home. Also related to how do we get children the resources that they need to learn at home is that often the families, the parents, or the caretakers, whether they're extended family members or not, who are taking care of those children are those essential workers, or were considered essential workers when most of us or many of us were working from home. These were the parents who were on the front lines going to work. And so they were not at home. So even if there was the ability to use a cell phone with a mobile Wi-Fi access, the likelihood is that cell phone was at work with that parent, that mother, that father, that grandparent, or other family member who was taking care of that child. So that really has become more of a conversation that we're all paying attention to. How do we ensure, and do we consider broadband access essential, and do we ensure everyone has the same speed? There are different speeds available, and some of you may or may not be familiar with that. That may be a little technical, but there are plans available where you'll have a lower speed, which means when everyone's on the internet, your speed is slower. So what does that mean when you are providing access or instruction online that requires a higher speed for the young person and families to access those resources and adequately address or participate in class? Really important things to think about. The second bullet I want to pay attention to in our brief is schools that serve Black children are less able to provide remote learning experiences. Why? Why does this matter? This goes back to my first slide and some of the context that both Noni and Pernisha shared, in that for many Black families, particularly in urban and also suburban environments, and then those who are in rural environments where they have less resources or live further from the center of town, those families are not able, those schools who rely on a tax base, should I say, and the tax base in those communities, particularly urban communities where the cost of homes are often depreciated because of either who lives in that community, it's a majority Black community or majority ethnically diverse community, or because that tax base has moved to the suburbs or the businesses are not in that community. The tax base that funds those public school systems have less money to update their Wi-Fi, to update their internet access, to ensure that all children have access to tablets or computers so that they can be attuned with more suburban districts or those districts or schools such as public schools or independent schools. So where you have a large population of Black children attending schools, they're usually attending older school buildings that were new years ago, but their systems, their infrastructure hasn't been updated. And across the country, certainly we're hearing a lot about how these school buildings are going through asbestos removal, or schools and school boards are trying to determine how to raise capital to create new buildings and to ensure that the schools have all the resources they need. So those districts are less nimble in responding, and were less nimble in responding to moving from an in-person, face-to-face learning model to a virtual model. Those were deficits that already existed, and they were essentially making do with what they had. But once COVID hit and children could no longer be in school, no longer have access to those hubs, those schools didn't have, a bunch of computers or tablets sitting aside. So those are things to think about. What does it mean? And how does it translate? How does the tax base translate? What does it mean? And how does that impact these children and families in their ability to learn and stay connected and excited about what they're learning in these virtual spaces? So a couple recommendations based on that. I know we don't have a lot of time, but as you prepare to welcome Black children and Black youth back to grounds, back to campus, back to community, to these learning communities, whether it's for sports, camps, whether it's for 4-H, whether it's for traditional education, whether it's for college, What do you need to do to prepare? Here are some recommendations, both based on our brief as well as some research that I've been doing with the Pennsylvania Humanities Council in Pennsylvania, a small but statewide organization. And so things that we've learned: do an organizational audit. You know, how many Black children and families are you serving? Do those Black children and families benefit, or how are they benefited from the services that you provide? Do they match the percentage of Black children and families living in your community? I love that. That's something I did when I was at Cornell University, and we were attempting to prepare for the demographic shift in New York State. So again, some communities are racially homogenous. Okay, can you then look at the poverty levels? Are you serving those lower income families at the percentages in which they live in your community? So do that organizational audit. Who are you serving? And if you're not serving them, what can you do to prepare to serve them? What moves can you make? Develop a plan for serving Black children, youth, and families. That plan is going to be multifaceted, and you do need to be aware of how trauma appears in front of you and what trauma may be happening at home. Some of you may have been hearing from your staff already or witnessing yourselves as a result of coming into the homes of families during COVID-19. So you need to develop a plan explicitly for working with Black children, youth, and families. We will hear, you may hear, we have a diversity plan. But all children and families of color are not the same. There are similarities and there are some similar disparities, but they're not the same. They don't work the same. The social expectations and communications are not the same. So what is your plan for working with this particular group of constituents, if you will? And then develop and strengthen partnerships and collaborations. These need to be on campus and off campus partnerships and collaborations. Who is it that you need to get to know better, or establish a relationship? Know that establishing a relationship takes time. Both Pernisha and Noni talked about the lack of trust in the medical system, the healthcare system, sometimes in the school system. There are parents who often tell stories about coming into public schools to talk about and advocate for their child and being dismissed or not even being seen by the principal about the issues and concerns they have with their child's education. So who do you need to develop relationships with? If there's a strong Christian base or Muslim base, I know that there's a large Hmong population in parts, for example, of Wisconsin. Are you developing relationships with their faith-based communities to understand how and what resources are most used in that community? Is that a place for you to collaborate so that they have a better opportunity when they're back connecting with the UW system? Are you paying attention to the local newsletters, to the local social media communications and resources that this community pays attention to? That's where you're going to learn. Who are the professionals in your network who are already connected? I'm not suggesting you burn them out, but I'm suggesting that you listen to them and read the resources and the research and the things that they do, because they've been doing it for a while. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, but there is a need to develop those partnerships and strengthen the ones that exist in places you ordinarily would not look. And those are typically the places where you're going to learn how to better serve Black children, youth, and families. Provide ongoing culturally responsive professional development. I'm glad we're here, and hopefully there'll be others for you. That means that once is not enough. You're not going to learn everything you need to learn about serving Black children and families in one professional development. So when I think about the work of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council, they determined by looking at the demographic shifts and the evaluation data that Black children were doing better. Although they were serving all children in Pennsylvania, they were doing better. And so they made a decision as an organization to serve more. So they just made a decision to partner with those libraries throughout the state of Pennsylvania who said, we're willing to serve Black children and youth, we're willing to serve low-income youth. What do we need to do? And learning and hearing from those libraries that we don't know how to serve them meant developing an entire year-long curriculum of professional development that helps them to understand culturally relevant teaching, culturally relevant learning. What are some profiles that we need to be aware of, informed of? Who should we be reading? Who should we be connecting with? So make sure that you have that system in place and that you're doing an evaluation of the changes that you are shifting to or what you have in place. You may already have a diversity equity plan in place that specifically speaks to the experiences of Black children, youth, and families, but are you evaluating how effective that plan is? Because that evaluation data will help you to look and see where you need to make adjustments and where you need to continue to do what you're doing well. learning about the communities that you are serving. One of the things I like to say, and there's a book called Ethnographic Eyes I use when I'm doing a research class, and there's the community walk. My favorite show, I must say, probably ages me, is Sesame Street. Who are the people in your neighborhood? What does that community look like? What's next to the school? What's next to campus? Are there public transportation systems available? Making sure that you know what's in the community that you're planning to serve a partner with, or that you're planning to recruit students with, whether you're recruiting them for camp or you're recruiting them for college. What's going on in that community? And you need to know that just as much as you know and understand what's going on in the UW system. And lastly, I mentioned this a little bit, but developing an evaluation and assessment plan and be honest about the data. Is the data telling you you need to do things differently, or is the data telling you that you need to increase your goals? Of course, you want to have low hanging fruit goals for meeting and working with this community, but you also want to have aspirational goals that forces your system to grow and challenge and meet the needs of Black children, youth, and families. They don't need to be one or two families that you can point to and say they did great. I don't know what happened to the other 99 or 98 families. If you're taking these steps and you're paying attention to what we know from a research perspective and an evaluation perspective, you will begin to see an improvement in the relationships, not only the recruitment of Black children and youth, but also the retention. We know that we can recruit Black children and youth to schools, particularly large public institutions, but we know that the attrition rate is often dismal. And so when you're taking these steps and becoming comfortable being uncomfortable, I love to say that when you're doing this work, when you're planning to serve Black children, families, and youth, you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because it means that you will be probably unearthing some things about your organization and or yourself that need to be addressed and adjust to do this work well. So some basic takeaways that's related to the research, and then partnering with those businesses. I didn't say that explicitly, but who isn't? Is it Comcast? Is it another company that can provide those digital hubs? They are always looking, are there additional computers sitting somewhere on grounds that go to those families? What resources, this goes back to that partnership, are available that may be low cost or no cost that you can get into the hands of those families? And don't consider it being unequal, consider it addressing the inequities that exist for Black children and families. So if that's what they need to elevate their opportunities and experiences, it's not unfair. You're working to address equity in a system that we know is unequal and inequitable for Black children and families. So enough of what I've shared, and I'm going to pass this over to my colleague, Dr. Erin Bogan, who's going to talk a little bit about how this relates to the emotional experiences that Black children and families have. And I want to thank you for your time.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry about that. Okay, well, I will go ahead then. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about the possibility of trauma without traumatization. And so what we're talking about here is really the emotional response that our students and the children and youth that we're working with have in the face of some of these challenging events. And so some of my colleagues talked a bit about the negative feelings that naturally occur as a result of experiencing some kind of traumatic event. And so when we have these negative feelings and we are sort of bombarded with emotions that seem overwhelming, it makes it more likely that we begin to ruminate, and those negative emotions set in a way that becomes, on a neurological level, a thought pattern. And so that's when we begin to see things like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, or depression. What's fueling those conditions is really unregulated negative emotion. And so I believe we have one very powerful protective factor and tool at our disposal, which is emotion regulation. And emotion regulation is simply the ability to modulate and control your emotions. So looking under the hood of emotion regulation, it's really interesting to understand what's happening to your brain as you are controlling your emotions. And you may wonder, well, how can simply controlling my emotions protect me from trauma? And we are wired for resilience. So our brains are plastic, meaning they're malleable and changeable. And this means whatever we choose to think on the most will grow. And sorry, I'm getting some feedback in the background. So whatever we choose to think about will grow, be it good or bad. So this means if we consciously bring positive thoughts and memories and messages to our consciousness, the physical substrate of a traumatic memory actually weakens. And we have what's called a Krebs gene or a switch gene. And so when we're thinking about something, again, good or bad, it sparks this process of protein synthesis. So we actually, I have a little picture in my slides, but it actually creates, if you could imagine, sort of like a highway for similar thoughts. So it creates proteins that connect like branches to other proteins at a synapse. And that allows for that kind of thought to be processed more quickly. And so on a neurological level, consciously changing your perspective and finding a positive outlook actually rewires that network, that system to hold other positive thoughts. And so when you're thinking about positive things, particularly in the midst of a very challenging moment, it causes a chemical reaction. Chemicals are released. So oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin actually attack the traumatic thought. And this weakens that connection. So those chemicals strengthen that positive network and weaken and desynchronize the neurons in that negative network, which creates a weakened negative emotional response. And so essentially all this means is as we're thinking positive things, our brain latches onto that. It reproduces that positivity. It allows us to switch our mindset, and it really unwires some of the negative thinking and rumination that would cause us to experience traumatization. So there are a few things that I think are really important for putting this into action, and a few messages that I think are really key for you, both you and your students, to internalize. The first is that you are not a victim to your emotions. And so one of the things that science tells us is that what we pay attention to dictates what we think about, which dictates our emotional response. And for teenagers specifically, emotions can feel very overwhelming and they may think they don't have control over them. But science tells us if we can control what we give our attention to, essentially we can control that whole pathway that ends at that emotional response. Another really important thing to consider is helping your students to use emotion words. And so being able to verbalize and label those emotions, that's something we teach kids very early. You know, we tell 2-year-olds throwing a tantrum, use your words, because when you begin to use your words to verbalize, it really takes us out of that flight or fight, um, hot reactive processing, and allows for that emotion to no longer just be felt, but to really move from the inside out to a place where it can then be controlled. And then another thing that's really important is to, as you know, are working towards building students' social emotional repertoire, emotion regulation is one facet of that. And I would argue the most important, particularly for our children of color. Remember that just like trauma is very individualized, so should our reactions and our strategies for dealing with the negative emotions that accompany it. I get very annoyed with social emotional learning interventions that have this one size fits all approach. We have to have strategies that reflect our culture, our context, our daily lives, our values, the things that we're experiencing. And students need to learn how to begin to think about and recognize what those things are in their realm and their sphere of control, so that they can develop strategies for regulating their emotions, for calming themselves down, that actually fit their lives. There are some things, however, that science says are very critical in making emotion regulation more effective. One of those things is breathing. And it sounds very simple, but breathing actually has a lot of very powerful effects on our brain and our physiology. It attenuates that stress response, and it takes us from a place of being reactive to being able to think through. And so I would say, whatever the strategy is that you're helping your students to develop, encourage them before anything to just stop, pause, and breathe. Self-talk is also at the crux of any very effective emotion regulation strategy. And it's something that we do naturally, which is why it's so effective. And you see, again, little children doing this as they're engaged in an activity, they're talking to themselves, and that's all self-talk or private speech, as some psychologists call it. That's all it is. It's talking yourself out of the tree, as my mother would say. And it's really just allowing yourself to create steps to move from that high arousal state to a place where you can then begin to do what psychologists call reframing. And so cognitive reappraisal or reframing is when you've gotten to a place where you're looking at the situation almost as if you're looking through a window and you're saying, okay, I'm going to see this crisis as a challenge, or how am I going to make this situation work for me? And that's a mindset that you develop. So emotion regulation is not just a strategy, although that's how it's often presented, but it's really a mindset of how do I turn this challenge or this difficult situation into a challenge that can work to my benefit. And then there are also just things that you can do to trick your brain, laughing, doing things that you enjoy. There's a theory called broaden and build that shows that if you are engaged in things that elicit positive emotion that you enjoy, if you play an instrument or an artist, or if there's something that you can kind of get wrapped into, it really broadens your thinking, your creativity, and expands your capacity for more positive emotions. So essentially what I described happening on a neurological level, the broaden and build theory emphasizes that. And so in thinking about supporting programming, it's first important that you understand your position in your students' ecology. You are an important adult that is there to support them. And so in order to do that, it's important that you are in a place where you can help them to regulate their emotions by regulating your own emotions. And so prioritizing your own mental health, prioritizing making sure that you're managing your stress well is really critical to being able to support your student. Um, Also encouraging altruism. There's a lot of research that shows that this also kind of tricks our brains. When we do something for someone else, it essentially is showing us and telling us that, okay, I have enough resources not only to take care of me, but to help someone else. Um, in addition to the benefit of helping someone else. And also, I would encourage you to show your vulnerability and model regulation. Research shows that that's how young folks begin to adapt and build this emotional resilience when they see it modeled. And so, if you're having a bad day, talk out loud about, and use emotion words. Talk about some of the ways you're thinking about the situation, how you're changing your perspective. And then another thing is thinking about future orientation. And so helping students to think about their future, as difficult as that may be with so much uncertainty, don't ask them things like, what do you miss? Ask them things like, what are you looking forward to? Have them to imagine, even if it seems fantastical. And then finally, I call this real parent and family engagement. And by that, I mean your organization or program's readiness to meaningfully uh, engage families in a way that really makes them partners. And so when we talk about equity, we're really talking about making sure that there is a consistency between what's happening in the home environment that's positive and what's happening in that program. And what that requires is the assessment of not only needs, but the assessment of strengths. What are families doing right? What are families doing to support their students? And making sure that those things are reflected in the programming so that there is a synthesis between those environments for the student. And then we often talk about belonging for students, and normally in the context of being, for example, a minority in a predominantly white environment. But to me, belonging really means something more than that. And we need to think about the belonging of our families and our parents. Do they not just have a mechanism to receive information from you, but to be influencers in that decision-making process, to be able, is there a mechanism for them to be able to make decisions and advocate for their child? Are they really involved in the process of planning and thinking and determining strategies to support their child? So I would encourage you to also adapt that broader definition of belonging. And then, of course, thinking about organizational readiness. This time is dynamic, and we have to be ready to reassess our goals, to have contingency plans, to be able to talk about difficult things like racism, and to address trauma. And so even if you are not in a place in your organization or your program to do that yet, you do have, again, one of the most powerful tools that I believe um, is a protective factor in these traumatic times for our youth. And that's the ability to help them to change their perspective and to begin to choose to think positively, even in the midst of a very challenging situation. And when you do that and help them to build that mindset, you're not just preparing them to deal with the pandemic, but any challenge that they may face in their future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erin Bogan. What we will do is we will do a breakout room for 10 minutes. And we want you all in your small groups to talk about what does trauma look like, or what might it look like in your program, and what plans are you planning on to create to support your youth? What are some of the ideas that you are thinking about to support your youth? So Tom will break you out into your rooms. We'll also put the question in the chat. And then what we want you to do is basically say, what might trauma look like in your program? And what are you preparing to do as of today to anticipate this? What we're going to do as you are returning is we're going to do kind of a yes and. Yes, this is a break, but at the same time, this is also a time to share out what you have talked about in your groups. If you like, it's play by choice. And then also an opportunity for you to ask any questions of our presenters. So feel free to unmute yourselves and share what you talked about in your group, or ask any questions.
I'm happy to share. I'm Karen Dreyfus. I'm with the UW Odyssey Project, Odyssey Junior, but I felt like our breakout room really touched on most everything the presenters shared: emotional dysregulation, financial need, access. And so a lot of our discussion was around how our individual programs or organizations were trying to make a plan and tackle some of those real-time needs and adjust to COVID. So I really appreciated the breakout rooms and enjoying the morning. Thank you.
Anyone else? We'd love to hear from all of you if you can, or put them in the chat. We can read the questions aloud.
I'm happy to share. Our group.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Pernisha. Thanks for everyone for putting this on today. We spoke about how to create safe educational environments that are both emotionally and physically safe. And there were some great examples about how people built trust through relationships early on, early on in the program. to learn about individual needs such as their tech access, so they can kind of prepare to make sure they're leveling the playing field for all the students that had a also creating connections between students, families, and their teachers outside of the educational environment, so making sure that there's that consistent like relationships built on like a network of support for all the students. And I even love, there was a great example about how they, on the first day, they actually meet the students outside the building and walk them in. If the building seemed kind of imposing. So I think that we had a nice discussion, and thank you everyone for being in my group.
Or does anyone have any questions for our presenters? Oh, go ahead, Dr. Oz.
Hey, Ozella Thomas from UW Whitewater. One thing we talked about in our group was the trauma of students being isolated. So students constantly been on Zoom, Zoomed out, WebEx out, and trying to bring students back to campus, you know, whether these are high school students or students who are doing summer camps, or our students, one campus have a daycare program. And so whether students are little or like teenagers, how to reteach social cues and interacting face to face is something we think we're going to really need to do to build that type of communication back up. And another thing, a gentleman mentioned from UW Milwaukee, I believe, Talent Search, he said that a lot of their students wasn't necessarily participating as much as they generally do. And so what they started was something called, what was it called? Something nights. Like Zoom nights or mentor nights, where they actually met with students in the evening. They can come in and talk about anything they want to talk about for like an hour. And so they said they had great participation with students that's coming in, just rapping and chatting about various things.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for that innovation in that space. I know a lot of our youth are having to take care of younger siblings. They're also having to work during the day. So the typical pre-college model of, you know, having a 9-to-5 program may not work for our students in virtual spaces. And we're definitely seeing that it's not always working for schools. And so now is the time to kind of plan for that as well. And also, I would encourage you to work with your campus legal counsel and to think about what does accommodations look like for your programs, because every program is different. But what does COVID-19 accommodations look like if you have a vulnerable student whose family is not ready to get them vaccinated, but yet they need this program to get in college? How are you anticipating those students? And what are your obligations in anticipating that? All righty, so we have about 1 minute left. Are there any last minute questions, or do any of the doctors want to address the question they've seen in the chat before we move on to Camp Doc? I mean, not Camp Doc, American Camp Association.
Just briefly, I saw that there was a question about blended programming when it comes to technology. Things I'll share with you contacting all the experiences is one, seeing if you can get a company, whether it's a tech company or business, to is why Hotspot is available in Hotspot. So you might use Samsung, Verizon, IBM, etc. You might also use snail mail, so book boxes. Is there a way for you? It's always nice to get something under the umbrella. Young people may not know as much about things, but can you mail things to them? Can you also use text messages options for being in contact and staying connected? So they may not be able to see you, they may be able to contact you via text message. And then are there info hub spaces that you can use alternately instead of just this video Zoom, etc.? And the last thing I would say related to what Pernisha just shared and Dr. Oz is don't forget, young people are multitaskers. Annenberg studies show every year that young people are multitaskers. They are on their phone, their email, etc., but they are now learning, and they're on TikTok, and they're on Twitter, and they're somewhere else. So it's not just that they are exhausted by being in social media connected, it's the way we're learning and teaching in addition to these other spaces where they're spending their social time. So we want to think about that as well. And again, I can share more information at another time, but I did want to at least address that question and give some quick ideas. Thank you, Pernisha.
Thank you so much. So you all will be able to see their presentation on our website probably in the next week or so. And we will also share their research. They have a 2-page document that is a really great read. So you can add that to your toolbox as you're preparing to bring minors back. So thank you again, Dr. Noli Gaylord, Dr. Erin Bogan, and Dr. Valerie Bass. You all have been truly inspirational I can't thank you enough.